My name is Emily Landon, and we are very excited to present this webinar series for you. The strategic plan is a historic step in charting an end to human trafficking, and we are grateful to have you today. Created in 2019, the Coordinating Council is a group of some of the top state agencies working together to coordinate and lead the human trafficking efforts across the state. The Coordinating Council's work is comprehensive across all aspects of trafficking, from prevention to victim identification, investigation, prosecution, rehabilitation, and beyond. We've broken the strategic plan down into 5 pillars on how to eradicate human trafficking: prevent, protect, prosecute, provide support, and partner. Each webinar, as you now know, will take place at 12 p.m. every Tuesday for the next few weeks. At each webinar, we have a select group of subject matter experts, Coordinating Council leaders, and human trafficking survivors to speak on the section. Today, we will be speaking about provide support. We have a phenomenal panel of experts today representing the Coordinating Council as well as some of the other members of the community. As presenters, we have Andrea Sparks, the director of the Child Sex Trafficking Team for the Governor's Office. We have Todd, who is the administrator and prevention and policy for the Child Sex Trafficking Team. We also have Courtney Arbor, the director of Workforce Division at TWC. And we have Lisa Michelle, the executive director at No Strings Attached. As I noted, today we'll be talking about providing support to survivors through trauma-informed and responsive services. If you have any questions that pop up along the way during the webinar, we encourage you to use our chat box as well as our Q&A section. Once you put your question in, we'll make sure to add your question to the queue. As I just noted, we also have the chat box, so please feel free to include your comments in there as well. The Coordinating Council would like to thank everyone who has fought tirelessly on this issue and this crime, and we look forward to today's discussion. If you have any remarks as well, please feel free to send us an email. We've put it in our intro slides, and we'll make sure to wrap up the webinar with that email as well. With that, I'm going to toss it over to Andrea.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our Provide Support webinar. I'm so honored to be part of the Coordinating Council and really believe in the work we're doing to further strategies in Texas. We're going to be talking about this part of the strategic plan that is all about victim services, both short and long term. And I'm not going to read the strategic plan elements to you, but it's really about trauma-informed care, training stakeholders to make sure that they understand what that means, and basically bringing in promising practices that we've kind of found in other states and within our own state, leveraging existing services that exist for these victims and getting our big networks of, sex assault exam providers and domestic violence shelters and CASA volunteers ready for this kind of population. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Todd real quick to talk about our first prong, which is training stakeholders to recognize victims.
Thank you, Andrea. And as Andrea mentioned, the focus of this section of the strategic plan is really about providing support to survivors of human trafficking. And the Coordinating Council, found it really obvious that we're not going to be able to provide those services and supports unless we first become really adept at identifying the victims and survivors in need of those services. So the first strategy is all around recognizing victimization and understanding what that really looks like, because a lot of the challenges to recognizing victims inform the strategies that we need to understand in order to properly serve them. So on the next slide, you're going to see something really simple. There's no single profile of a trafficked person. And that's a challenge for us in this space, because you see a lot of public awareness campaigns and activities meant to be helpful in terms of knowing that trafficking is a problem, but sometimes they unintentionally focus on one particular demographic. And the reality is victims of sex and labor trafficking come from all walks of life. There's not a certain demographic or zip code or anything like that that contributes to victimization. And it's really important to understand that so that we're looking for the signs and recognizing it our team in the governor's office focuses a lot on child sex trafficking, but these same barriers apply especially to labor trafficking. You know, when you have victims of labor trafficking, they often appear to be engaged in some sort of legitimate work. And so it's really difficult as a community to recognize whether that work has been forced or coerced. But we have to do a better job of identifying that victimization in order to intervene as early as possible. And even though, you know, there are a variety of risk factors that we could focus on, we could look at things like, you know, economic security, for example, prior sexual abuse, access to safe and healthy relationships. Those are all things that have been shown to have a higher likelihood of potential victimization. But the reality is, at this time, especially in our world, everyone is more vulnerable just given our utilization of technology. Young people especially are vulnerable to recruitment, to grooming. And truth be told, this is not only sex trafficking. We see it certainly sexual activities being brokered online, but also those that are in economic hardship that might be recruited using the internet, false promises of certain types of employment. And I think, you know, it would be a disservice not to talk about the reality of the internet in our current time and the challenges that it poses to us to keep up with technology and responding to this. I also want to highlight the fact, you know, that a lot of our public understanding of human trafficking is not totally accurate. You heard, if you joined for the Prevent section of the Coordinating Council Strategic Plan, conversations about public awareness and great activities like the Be the One training video and the Can You See Me campaign that paint a more accurate picture of what trafficking looks like. But a lot of folks still think this is about stranger danger, that this is always about abduction and being held against your will. But we're seeing an uptick in things like familial trafficking. What you see here are 3 women just in the last couple of years in Texas that have had alleged trafficking of family members. We see a lot of tie to this, especially with drug addiction, people that are trading sexual acts with members of their family in order to meet their rent, to meet their drug addiction, to meet those needs. And so I think, again, recognizing trafficking in all its different forms is going to help us to intervene early and recognize this victimization. One of the challenges and something that plays a big role later in the strategic plan in providing services is the role of trauma in trafficking victimization. What you see here, this animal that looks to be just frozen, right, under attack. And a lot of people, when this image first went viral, thought, oh, how sweet. That is a mother protecting her children because there were her offspring nearby. And everyone thought, oh, she's just giving herself in sacrifice to protect them. But the reality is, this animal, we often hear about fight or flight. There's a third option there, which is freeze. And this animal was frozen in that moment, unsure of what to do, recognizing that escape was not likely and just succumbing ultimately to that victimization. And oftentimes that's what things appear to be like with our survivors of trafficking. And to be perfectly honest with you, that's what traffickers want. They want victims who look complicit in their own victimization. They want somebody who looks like they're willing to engage in this domestic servitude, somebody that looks like just a prostitute. You know, that is what they want to appear. And so they build that distrust of systems. And frankly, they frame a person that society doesn't recognize as a victim, but that trauma that they've endured plays a big role in why they appear complicit, and understanding that trauma is going to be a key factor in responding to their needs. And we'll hear about that a little more later. I wanted to acknowledge, you know, so much of this section of the plan is about improving and awareness of trafficking. And the state of Texas has really been doing this over a decade through legislation. What you see represented on the slide here, each of these boxes actually represent a different law in the state of Texas with regards to either awareness signage so that people know how to contact a hotline and reach out for help, or specific training for certain professionals to recognize trafficking. And so we have training for groups like law enforcement since 2009, for cosmetologists, for those working in the massage industry. And most recently, last session, we have mandatory training for healthcare professionals. So many survivors indicated that they came into contact with a healthcare professional during their victimization, but it was never identified. And so I want to acknowledge the really hard work that the Health and Human Services Commission has done in ensuring that we have vetted appropriate training that covers trauma, sex, and labor trafficking, that we have access to free training for these healthcare professionals, and also acknowledge all of the different health professional boards, the medical board, the pharmacy board, the dental board, all that are working really hard together to make sure that those who could potentially come in contact with a victim are trained to recognize the signs. But beyond that, as you'll see on the next slide, it's not just about training. We could all go through a training and hear the indicators, but we could walk away with a different feeling in our gut when a potential victim comes across our path. And so what you see here is a representation of one screening tool called the SIA. It's a tool that we're using across the state of Texas to screen young adults for potential sex trafficking and exploitation. The research that led to this tool indicates that most victims do not outcry about their victimization. They may not even self-identify. And so if we wait for disclosures from trafficking victims, we're going to intervene far too late in their road of trauma. And so we want to be proactive. We want to implement validated screening tools for sex and labor trafficking. And what you see from this tool is that even in a state like Texas, where we're screening the most high risk, we're screening kids with child sexual abuse histories, with juvenile justice histories, we're not going to break any system by screening theirs. We've had over 35,000 youth screened in Texas, and only about 13% have been screened as a clear concern for exploitation. That's not diagnostic. It just tells us that there is reason to have a high concern that exploitation has happened, and we need to take a further step to assess that and get them services. And this is so critical because it's an objective way that we can implement the same tool and determine whether we need to take that next step. And it's important for us to take the lessons we've learned with this screening and also apply them to labor trafficking. I'm going to pass it over to Courtney now to talk a little bit about recognition of labor trafficking and how we respond to that. Because again, if we wait for these victims to come to us, we're going to intervene far too late. So if we can be proactive and recognize those signs, we'll be much better off in responding to their needs.
Todd, I'm glad that you mentioned labor trafficking. It's sometimes overlooked in these discussions because it's so much less obvious to a lot of us. We drive down downtown streets and we don't necessarily, our senses aren't necessarily trained to look for labor trafficking like we are trained to look for sex trafficking. But it's clearly an issue. It's understood that there are about 25 million people globally who are stuck in some type of forced labor. That ranges from bonded labor, where a person is held because of a debt. I will help you get into this country, or you can stay here and work, but you will owe me a fee. And that is never to the benefit of the worker in these situations. Forced labor is another example. It's really prominent. There is often either a person is physically detained and held to work, or there is a threat of harm to the person or their family or their reputation. And so by doing those things, a person will continue to work in under duress and without any kind of formal agreement or reasonable pay. Child trafficking, you do hear more about. And that can range in some countries to where governments or leaders are forcing youth or children into armed combat, or in some cases, kids are recruited and pushed into drug trafficking, pornography, prostitution, or one of the more common ways that children are trafficked, and we don't always know to look for it, is in domestic roles. Families may have their children recruited into trafficking and think that they are giving their child a chance at a better life and a better education. In America, for instance, a person may bring in young people from another country and say that they will, or one child, to work in their own home, and it's going to provide opportunity for education and just open doors. And of course, that is not what is playing out once the child is here. I listed some of the trafficking risk factors here. It won't surprise anyone to know that anything that can be exploited by a trafficker is exploited, both in sex trafficking and labor trafficking. If a person is here without legal right to work in the U.S., or if they're economically disadvantaged, then traffickers will look for those weak spots and exploit them to keep so many individuals working, again, without with often no pay or very low pay, and sometimes abuse and neglect. Next slide. Recognizing labor trafficking, as we've talked already about, is key to being able to take the first step toward helping victims. It's been very encouraging in the last few years and even months. We see a lot of local task forces being developed and coalitions with employers and nonprofits and religious organizations, faith-based organizations, and state agencies partnering together to help identify and refer victims into various programs where they can receive help, both on the labor and the sex trafficking side. Building awareness through social media and signage, I think, is also really important. Not only are we sharing information with each other and to the public, we're also making it obvious to victims that we may have an understanding of what is happening, and give them an open door to ask questions if they would like to do that, or start a discussion with anyone in any of our organizations. At the Workforce Commission, we have a lot of grants where we're assisting people in getting to work and finding education, but we also have some regulatory programs, and it's very important. We have learned and continue to recognize that asking the right questions when we are involved in a labor law investigation, or if our staff are on a farm talking with migrant workers about their situation, their employment contract, or if we're working with H-2A workers who are they're here with a temporary ag visa. When we're touching base with them about their work situation, it's important to ask good questions. And then in the day-to-day in our different workforce solutions offices, which I'll talk more about in just a moment, we often are working with youth and adults who come into the office with some type of barrier, and they're looking for work, trying to find out how to get their next training or finish a degree, or start a degree or certificate program, and asking questions and really listening for the response, and letting them tell us all of the story they would like to share with us is ever important. So I'll hand it over now to Andrea.
I'm going to talk about a big one, which is training stakeholders in trauma-informed practices. We can build all the programs in the world, and we can, throw a whole bunch of grant money at residential treatment and specialized foster homes and therapies. But the bottom line is, if we don't make sure that these services are trauma-informed, they're not going to work, and they're actually going to do more harm than good. So we want to talk about trauma-informed and responsive care. It's not just enough to be informed about trauma, but you have to act on that information and actually be responsive to the trauma in a way that doesn't re-traumatize victims. We're going to talk about stages of change and what that means for our services. And then we're going to talk a little bit about cultural competency. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the trauma that comes, especially with trafficking victims. It's complex trauma. It's very difficult for them to work through. And basically they are the very things that kept them alive when they were being trafficked, their survivor instinct, that fight, flight, or freeze, or submit response that kept them alive when they were being exploited, are the same brain behaviors that make them very hard to help once they're recovered. And so they're stuck in that trauma mode. Their brain is stuck in that mode many times, and it makes it very difficult for them to receive help, and makes it difficult for us to give help. They're triggered, especially by authority figures, because if you think about it, most of these victims have been around authority figures, whether in the child welfare system or the juvenile justice system, law enforcement. They've been arrested sometimes, unfortunately. And so they're triggered by that. And so when they're around authority figures, when they're being recovered by law enforcement, they might not understand that this law enforcement officer is actually trying to help them, and they will have a trauma response that could include, running, hitting, yelling, all of those things that make them really hard to help. They're also triggered by power struggles. And let's face it, a lot of our residential programs and other programs, especially for youth, can cause some power struggles when there are rules that kids don't understand why they have to, I know we're all thinking about our own kids right now and power struggles, why you have to, follow the rules. A lot of power struggles ensue, and that is especially triggering for these survivors who've had to struggle with power, their traffickers for sometimes years. They have very hard difficulty regulating their impulses. They have somatic symptoms, so physical symptoms that arise, and it seems to be unexplained, but it's related to trauma, lots of illnesses. They have difficulty trusting people, obviously, and or feeling close to anyone. So all of the things that protected them when they were in the life are now fighting against them as they're trying to get help. And the biggest thing I think with the difference between these victims and others is that there is such a sense of self-blame and shame because of the commercial aspect of their trafficking. Dr. Cross, who we work with a lot at TCU, says it this way. He said, the reason why this trauma caused by child sexual exploitation or youth sexual exploitation is so deep and difficult to overcome is because it corrupts one of the primary methods humans have to stay healthy and heal from hurts: intimate, trusting relationships. And so it makes it very difficult for victims to trust and form meaningful relationships, which are essential for their healing. So this is real stuff. And when we say trauma-informed responses, there's a real need for that. I want to talk a bit about one of our models that we have been rolling out, at least with commercially sexually exploited youth, and that is trust-based relational intervention. This is an intervention that's being used worldwide, literally worldwide, in child welfare, and it's born and bred right here in Texas at TCU. One of the things it does is it helps caregivers, so people who are providing care as a residential staff or a foster parent, teachers, anybody who is around a traumatized child, it gives them the knowledge they need to understand what's going on behind their behaviors. So instead of seeing their behaviors as a child, being bad, they're understanding the trauma that's causing it and helping them to help that child regulate that trauma and then reduce the behaviors. Just one quick example about this. Kinder Shelter, which is a shelter in Houston, emergency shelter for kids, was having about 45 runaway incidences per quarter. And they got help with TCU and implemented TBRI. And the very next quarter, they went from 45 runaway incidences to 3. So you can tell you that, that tells you that these kids are feeling safer there. The staff is not having those power struggles with the kids. We also see TBRI reducing things like physical restraints as well. So we're very encouraged by it and hoping to expand TBRI to law enforcement trainings as well as trainings for providers of adult victims as well. Next slide. I want to talk about stages of change. Some of you may have seen this in addiction models, and it definitely applies in this situation as well with trafficking. So most of our victims, when they are recovered or they have an intervention with law enforcement or first responder, they don't even realize that they're being victimized. They're in what's called pre-contemplation stage, and they don't understand that there's any need to change what they're doing right now. In fact, they will often, because they're traffickers, Todd mentioned this earlier, want them to they will present as being complicit in their own exploitation. So it's very important for first responders and really anyone who's working with a survivor to understand that these survivors often don't understand that they're being victimized, and they will treat the person trying to help them as the enemy. But we can, and through our CSA advocates, we'll talk about CSA advocacy in a minute, we are able to help them move through those stages of change so that eventually they are ready, they are preparing, and they are acting on what they need to do to heal from the trauma. The bad news is this includes, the stages of change model includes many relapses. But the good news is we are prepared for that. Our residential and community-based providers understand the stages of change. They enact safety plans with these survivors, knowing that they may run, they may call their trafficker, they may slip up and want to come back to that placement. And absolutely, we evaluate our placements and our services based on how they do that. We don't want ever to give up on a survivor because they've relapsed. That's part of the process. The other good news is that every time there's a relapse, there's an opportunity to learn what triggered that relapse, and the survivor's actually made stronger. So part of something that we just all need to know in dealing with these survivors. Next slide, please. And we're going to talk about, I mentioned this just a minute ago, our specialized advocates and case management services. So next slide. We understand that survivors of trafficking really thrive when there is a supportive adult relationship that they can rely on, a trust-based relationship. And because of what I said earlier, because of their specific kind of trauma, it's very hard to create that. But we have created a model called CSA advocacy, which is commercially sexually exploited youth. So we say CSA advocacy, which does exactly that. And as we've created this and applied it to child and young adult survivors, we are recognizing the need for this to be the brand of advocacy that all human trafficking survivors get, adult and everybody. And basically what it means is that advocates should meet these survivors where they are, both literally, like go out into the field to them. Don't wait for them to come to your office and, make an appointment and keep those appointments. That's not going to happen, especially when so many of these survivors are in pre-contemplation stage and don't even understand that they're being victimized. So meet them in the field, be with them in the field, and also meet them where they are figuratively along that stages of change, understanding where they are. You don't want to start forcing a survivor into case management or therapy when they don't even see a need for that. So they are providing for basic needs, they're building rapport, they're building that trusting relationship, especially in those first 72 hours. They're accompanying them to appointments, they're taking care of what the survivor thinks they need. It's up to them to perceive their needs and then express those, and then the advocates will meet those needs. Next slide, please. So with the advocacy, we've got about 134 counties covered with CSA advocacy right now. We've served about 2,000 young adults and kids, but we still have a long ways to go. And I want to talk about the other kinds of services that we have worked together as a state to develop along these lines for survivors. So of course, it takes much more than a residential placement and an advocate to meet the needs and to heal from complex trauma that these survivors have. We're talking about health, lots of health problems based on, due to their victimization. They've been beaten, they've been starved, they've been sexually assaulted. Obviously, labor trafficking victims have all kinds of issues with neglect and maybe malnutrition. Mental health, of course, we mentioned the trauma, depression, anxiety, dissociative disorders. Their safety is huge. We cannot underestimate when a survivor is afraid of their trafficker. We have to take that very, very seriously, because we do know of a lot of instances of retaliation and further violence when a victim tries to leave. Housing, just having a place that's safe and welcoming for them to live. Their legal needs, whether that is pursuing clemency for crimes that they were made to commit due to their trafficking situation, or custody battles they may be in with their trafficker. They many times have kids and their trafficker engages in a custody battle with them. Education and jobs. So many of these victims have not had exposure to education or job skills. And Courtney talked about that and how TWC is engaged in that. And we are so grateful for their engagement. Of course, financial stability, economic empowerment, relationships, healthy relationships, and that sense of belonging to a community. You know, as horrific as trafficking is, traffickers create the sense of a community many times with their victims, and that they're all in this together. And so when we take them out of that community, even though we know we are keeping them from being exploited, we still need to build a community on the other side for them. Next slide, please. So all of those services need to be in place, and really it's individualized services. How do we even begin to meet the needs of traffickers? We believe that advocates and case managers, that is their job, and that's what they're doing. They're connecting each survivor to the services they need along the continuum. And so we absolutely have to grow those programs for our adult victims as well. And we also have some other short-term services that we have been funding. We have 4 emergency shelters. We need a lot more. That is a service that we don't have enough shelters. We don't have enough shelter space for these kiddos who are recovered. We have 8 drop-in centers where kids can come off the street, they can get their needs met, they can start to build a relationship, and then eventually leave that exploitative situation and get and start new relationships with trusted adults. And then we have 4 juvenile justice-based programs, because the reality is a lot of these kids are identified as victims once they're in a juvenile justice program, once they're going through probation. The probation officers are seeing the signs, and they need programming as well. We also have longer term services, because we realize, again, this is a cyclical healing process and it's long term. So community case management and counseling programs for adults. Not everybody needs a residential placement. Many of these survivors can do well living with a relative, living on their own, if they're a child living at home, as long as they have the supports they need in the community to stay safe. We also have residential programs for youth and residential programs for adults, because some people do need that separate kind of housing situation and a very intense residential treatment program. So all of these programs we evaluate with custom measures that they report on quarterly. Evaluation of services is part of the strategic plan. We still have a lot of work to do there, but we are evaluating these programs and making adjustments as necessary, learning along with them. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it back over to Courtney to talk about some of the services that TWC can provide.
There are so many great entry points in our state that have developed through the years, including all of those that Andrea just mentioned. But one that I just wanted to highlight today, because we're really growing in ability to provide services and interest in partnering with different organizations who are helping survivors of trafficking, is the Workforce Solutions System. The Workforce Commission funds local workforce boards, and the funding actually plays out in the form of programs in local workforce solutions offices. You likely have one in your area or within a few miles if you're in a small town, perhaps the larger town nearby, but there are more than 180 workforce solutions offices. And I've listed here some of the different partners that are engaged in the workforce system, and who our local workforce solutions staff are working with in the day-to-day to help, you know, on the face of what we're all doing, it's to help employers find the talent pipeline they need and help job seekers find jobs. But within that are a lot of different subgroups that we're serving. The majority of the dollars we're using are federal dollars, and they're very, very targeted toward individuals with barriers, whether they're youth or adults. And so youth and adults who are have come out of a life of trafficking or this terrible crime, and who are ready to start pursuing education and employment, these workforce solutions offices and the partners that we work with are a really good resource. I mentioned earlier that I know that getting a full-time job is not the first thing that needs to happen. There are other steps that have to be taken, I know, for victims to overcome some of what they have endured. And I certainly recognize that, but I think as soon as there is an interest as part of the community building, even as Andrea mentioned, and part of the creating a path to a different life, Workforce Solutions can be a great resource and connect these individuals with all kinds of different programs, depending on their age and the type of education they're looking for, the type of work they're looking for. It can open a lot of doors. The next slide just talks briefly about some of the services that are available. The partners were listed on the last slide here. Again, on the face, we're helping employers with tax credit information, which, by the way, some of the customers are the participants that would be served that might be referred by a nonprofit or another organization who have been a victim of trafficking, may be eligible, or the employer might be eligible for a tax credit for hiring this person if they've been receiving TANA for food stamps or any of the other public assistance that makes employers eligible for tax credits if they hire the person. So those local staff can really help anyone who is looking for work and how to make that known to an employer. It gives them a little bit of a leg up in the interviewing process. And then they can find help with writing a resume, career information, what jobs pay well in the area, what jobs seem to be growing. And as we all know, during the pandemic, some jobs are struggling more than others. Some industries are struggling more than others, but the local staff are able to help point people in the direction where there's some promise of a good job. And in some cases, training can be paid for by Workforce Solution, and others, they can point them to other resources. But there is a lot of opportunity in these local offices for anyone who is on this road to recovery and looking to get into employment as part of that solution. I believe Todd is up next.
Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, just really briefly, I wanted to acknowledge, we're going to hear in a little bit from Lisa and Michelle with the Survivor Leaders Council, and something that Lisa and others have really helped us to understand is that a barrier to a lot of survivors in accessing employment and accessing other services that they really need is their own perceived criminal history. And so I think we've come a long way with the trainings that you've heard about, but oftentimes survivors present to the system and, again, appear complicit, look like somebody that is engaged in an illegal act. Maybe it's prostitution. Maybe they've been forced by their trafficker to run drugs. Maybe they are in a massage establishment without a license, advertising massage, a variety of things that they could present to and appear to be criminals, even though they're actually victims of exploitation and control by another. And that can be a barrier. And I wanted to highlight two particular forms of post-conviction relief in Texas. Last session, the statewide task force, which includes a lot of the coordinating council members, recommended improvements to our non-disclosure statute in Texas, which basically is just a remedy for survivors to petition a court and say, hey, yes, I was convicted of this activity, but I was actually engaged in it as a victim. And those changes really streamlined that particular remedy, allowed to consolidate from multiple locations around the state, and also gives you a chance to legally be free from even acknowledging that activity on job applications and other forms. And also the Board of Pardon, Paroles and the governor came together to create a specialized clemency application. So again, survivors can apply for clemency as a victim of trafficking or domestic violence when they show that that activity that they were engaged in was actually as a result of their trafficking. And hopefully we'll need these remedies less as we get better at identifying it on the front end. But the reality is sometimes we don't catch that victimization until later, and we want to be sure that they have every access to pursue the support and the remedies that they need. So I'm going to give it back to Andrea for the last few minutes before we get to Lisa Michelle to talk about these final support strategies.
Yeah, so just last kind of strategies around providing support is to develop care coordination teams. And this is something we've done, next slide, for youth in the state of Texas through our children's advocacy centers, who already have multidisciplinary teams staffing investigations and prosecutions of abuse cases, which includes child sex trafficking and child labor trafficking. So what this does is this really helps youth and their caregivers access services. You know, even if we fund services all over the state, it's really hard to know where to go. And sometimes there are barriers to eligibility and things like that the care coordination team can help with. So the idea is that this multidisciplinary team, you know, made up of law enforcement, the child welfare workers, juvenile probation, the advocate, healthcare providers get together and staff these cases, and then eventually invite the youth and their caregivers in, any protective caregivers in, to help staff the case and really come up with good solutions, individualized service planning for that youth. So we have heard loudly and clearly that our Survivor Leadership Council wants this for adults, and we're working on that right now. We have kind of a pilot going on and in the planning stages with Texas Association Against Sexual Assault. But we do believe, this is a best practice for children, and it should be interesting to see how this can help adults kind of navigate that space as well. And just the last slide, next slide, is we understand we have a lot of work to do in evaluating our services for effectiveness, although care coordination can help with that, and actually can help with all of these. Care coordination can help evaluate services because the advisory councils get together and discuss, what are we missing in our area? Why are survivors here not thriving, but they are here? What can we do better? We also work on braided funding opportunities. So, it shouldn't matter what system you come from, or if you're just a community kid who's living at home. If you need services, we're going to find a way to pay for those services and get you what you need. And then the third was to remove barriers to information sharing, which is so important. Care coordination can also help with that, because the members of the care coordination team have MOUs to share information between each other to get things done for that survivor. But still, we know we have a lot of work to do on those three strategies, and we'll continue to work on that in phase 2 of the strategic plan. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Emily to turn it over to Lisa Michelle. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Andrea. So the Coordinating Council published the strategic plan in last May, and we were really honored and grateful to have the Human Trafficking Survivor Leaders Council provide a report on our report and give their perspective on some of the things that we made, just to make sure that we're closing all the gaps and ensuring that we have a comprehensive message and we're including all viewpoints necessary for this discussion. So for our lucky pleasure today, we have Lisa Michelle, who is a member of the Human Trafficking Survivors Leaders Council, and will give us a little bit of their feedback on some of the strategies we identified in the strategic plan. So Lisa, go ahead and step in whenever you're ready.
Hello. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here today. I just want to read to you the survivor disclaimer from our council. The views, opinions, and thoughts and statements contained herein belong solely to the authors represented by the Human Trafficking Survivor Leaders Council, and not necessarily to the authors, employers, organizations, companies, committees, or groups that the authors are affiliated with. It's important to note that the Human Trafficking Survivor Leaders Council is a collaborative comprised of survivor leaders and experts with different lived experiences, hence different opinions, views, and thoughts. And the council does not assume to represent the opinions, views, and thoughts of all survivors of human trafficking. And as you can see here, these are the council members, which I am just thrilled to be with and to work with on this. You can go to the next slide. Our mission is to review, recommend, and develop survivor-informed policies and best practices that address commercial sexual exploitation and human trafficking across the state of Texas. And our vision is to see cultural change and sustainable practices that enhance efforts to end commercial sexual exploitation and human trafficking. Now, from our perspective as the council, some of the gaps that we've seen and we'd like to address right now is motivational interviewing is one of them, that training is needed for those that are interacting with trauma survivors. If you're not familiar with motivational interviewing, it is an evidence-based tool that service providers can use to assist clients as they move through the stages of change. And it creates behavior change. It empowers the survivor to make their own choices. And motivation is basically a method of communication. And the primary goal of motivational interviewing is to reduce and minimize resistance, to resolve ambivalence, and to elicit change talk and move towards the goals, values, and behavioral change. And if it's just incredible, it is so powerful to see this tool in action and to see the interaction with survivors and see them start to think for themselves and be able to make decisions for themselves. Because when you're in trauma, you go into this freeze state. And if you're familiar with TBRI and the trauma brain, this tool helps us as survivors to get into our upstairs brain, which is our thinking brain. And instead of staying in our downstairs brain, which is our trauma brain, which leaves us stuck and not actively changing. And to be able to think things through and learn how to start making decisions for ourselves. I think that's the hardest thing that I personally have had through my recovery, is just trying to find my voice and be able to make decisions and to be able to be empowered to make that decision instead of somebody else making it for me. I do know the Institute for Individual and Organizational Change. Some of our council has used them. I myself have as well. And their website is IFIOC.com, and I can put that in the comments as well. They have online training, and they have some free training as well that you can go on if you want to learn more about motivational interviewing. Now, moving on to case management and care coordination programs. They really, if they're not survivor informed, or you don't have a survivor that's on board with you, I highly recommend that you would bring them in and have them train your staff, or bring them in weekly to be working with the survivors that are in your care as well. And better yet, just hire them and have them work directly with your organization to be a leading voice in your protocols and in your case management as well. And I have to say that survivor leaders are some of the most brilliant, strongest, most resilient women that I've ever met in my life. And they will bring a wealth of leadership and value to your team and to your clients, and your organization will be a lot stronger for it too. So moving on to long-term therapy. If you don't have a trauma-informed therapist that is in-house working with you, contract them out and find ways to have them work with you in-house, and contracting them out as well. Partnering with qualified professionals that are trauma-informed, that have actually the work with working with survivors, is key. And if you haven't included them in your grants, include them in your grants as well. I know for me personally, on my journey of recovery, I had to meet with my counselor 2 to 3 times a week. And plus I had a support system surrounding my time of recovery. This was 23 years ago. And I spent decades working with my counselor on a regular basis and having that support system as well. So having trauma-informed therapy and outpatient treatments are critical to healing. And to this day, I still need them. I still get triggered. It's a lifelong process to heal from these atrocities. Next, I'd like to share with the client confidentiality. Eventually, our hope is that each survivor will have a life outside of trafficking as they rebuild their lives. And just like our counsel, it's amazing to watch. Not every survivor, though, wants to identify as one and share their story publicly. So if we keep that in mind, it protects them for their future. We want to be really cautious when we're sharing sensitive information and who we're sharing it with. Being careful not to re-exploit them over again by sharing their story without their permission. And the women and the youth that we work with in our organization, and that we've actually seen this happen, and we have a saying: if it's not your story to tell, please don't tell it. I know it's hard, but if it's not necessary to share with your colleagues, then please just don't. It breaks trust, and that trust is extremely hard to regain. So we highly encourage you to find a survivor leader who is willing to share their stories and compensate them for their time and their expertise, and have them share stories for you as well publicly.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. Michelle.
You're welcome.
Go ahead, Andrea.
I was just going to wrap up and answer a couple questions. Man, I was taking notes when Lisa was talking because we really value the Survivor Leadership Council's input. And just so you know, we are already working on motivational interviewing. We've got a training series throughout the state. I think we have some trainings this week, so that is coming to you. Any questions about the services that we already have in the state can be, you can answer them either on the AG's website or on our website as well. We have a lot of this information. Just wanted to point out too that today is Internet Safety Day. And I'm mentioning that because we are seeing, and we had a question about this that came through. We're seeing a variety of victims of human trafficking. So it used to be that we could say, okay, human trafficking, let's go protect our kids who are coming out of foster care, who are homeless, who are, in the juvenile justice system. And yes, that is still true. They are the most vulnerable youth, right? Those kids who already have kind of a break in their community and are looking for a new kind of family. But we are seeing more and more and more children being lured and groomed and even trafficked online. And so I just thought that was an important thing to note today, Internet Safety Day. And there's all kinds of resources that you can find today. In fact, the governor will be Facebooking some of those about how to keep your kids safer online. It's super important because we're seeing that everyone is vulnerable to human trafficking because of vulnerabilities and also the internet. And then I just wanted to, let everyone know that we will be working on phase 2 of this action plan. You can see that we've gotten some things done, but we still have a ways to go. We welcome input. You can provide input on our website. You can provide input to the AG's office. Our coordinating council will get it, and we take it very, very seriously. So thank y'all for being here today and for hearing about our first steps. And we look forward to working with you on our next steps.
Great. Thanks, Andrea. Before we kind of move into the Q&A, I just want to do a wrap up just with some of the administrative things. So just to remind you all, so we have a poll question here. So please fill out. We'd love to kind of hear your response and feedback. Like Andrea was saying, we really appreciate your time. We want to make sure that this information is productive and informative as possible. Additionally, we will be recording, as you can probably see, we're recording these webinars. We're in the process of getting them cleaned and posted. So just stay tuned. We will be sending those out to the attendees if you're interested. If you would like more information, we encourage you to send us an email and we will make sure that we get back to you and add you to our email list. So yes, recording will be, we will have it, but just kind of stay tuned for that. Okay, so as I know we're wrapping up with time, I just want to kind of open this up for a question and answer section. We have Claire Brookman here from the Attorney General's office who will kind of lead us on some questions, and hopefully the panelists will be able to address them. So Claire, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Great, thanks Emily, and thank you to all our wonderful panelists. So we had a lot of good questions that have come up. The first one, I think, Andrea, if you could answer. We had a question about sort of the different types of victims that are out there. I know you or Todd talked about how there's not one profile of a victim, but if you could talk about victims from different backgrounds, different economic classes, how some are maybe not marginalized and what kind of services or how we meet them where they are.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is no, profile of a trafficking victim, unfortunately. And so it's very, very difficult for us to recognize these victims sometimes. And so we're seeing a variety of different victimization, especially as a lot of the stuff moves online. It could be a child who's in high school and is connected to the wrong crowd, and it could be a kiddo whose parents have just gone through a divorce and they're feeling lonely and they're reaching out on social media and sharing more information than they should. It could be someone who's traumatized by an event in their lives and that trauma makes them more vulnerable. It could be a mental illness, it could be depression, anxiety. You know, there's so much going on in our society right now. And with the pandemic, we know that people are even more vulnerable economically and socially, you know, feeling very isolated. So variety of victims, and that's why we built our model to respond to a variety of victims. So not everybody needs a residential treatment center, not everybody needs a foster home. Some people just need really good counseling, motivational interviewing, TBRI. Some families just need some help in how to handle trauma. So that's very, very important. Variety of victims, variety of response.
Great, thank you for sharing that. The next question, Lisa, I think everyone was really excited about some of the information that you shared about this motivational interview website. And I was hoping you could maybe talk about that again. And, you know, if you're able to give us maybe an example of a type of question that would, you know, make a victim close down versus a type of question that would make them open up. I think everyone would be interested in hearing more about that.
Whoops. Hold on one second.
Claire, just so you know, I shared the website for our motivational interview training that we're doing with Baylor specifically for this population. I put it in that answer. So hopefully that'll help with that.
Great, thank you. Sorry, Lisa, go ahead.
Okay, first of all, I'm not the expert on this. I'm learning about it myself, actually. And I've been on stings before with law enforcement, and it's amazing. If you don't ask yes and no questions and you kind of get the victim to think for themselves, that's the most important thing. And then just being a really good listener and have reflective listening is so important when you're interviewing and speaking. And this really is something that I feel, you know how TBRI has gotten really big, and that's because of the governor's office, all the training and all of the education. But I believe that motivational interviewing will be kind of the next thing, because it really gets us, the survivor, out of that. We start to think for ourselves. And so it's quite involved. And if you go onto that website, you'll see a lot of that, but there's a lot of training in it. So.
Great, thank you. I think everyone's really excited about that.
Cool.
So I think we also have some questions about the workforce. So maybe Courtney, if you want to jump in. We had a question about when survivors do get back into the workforce, if they see their trafficker, you know, how do we prevent them from being re-traumatized, or maybe talk more about, you know, getting them back into the workforce and sort of the, you know, pitfalls and what to look out for with that, if you have any insight.
Well, I think that's a great point. Organizations that are serving trafficking survivors really have to think through a full range, right, of scenarios that a person may encounter. What I've found really encouraging is that so many employers are building awareness and interest in this crime, and wanting to hold, like associations, wanting to educate their employer base about the possibility that labor trafficking or sex trafficking could be happening in their industry, and holding their own employer base accountable. And in addition, you may have heard Secretary of State Ruth Hughes has convened employers a number of times to build a coalition of employers around this topic. I think the main thing is to, I'm not an expert in the trauma-informed care either, but I think talking through different scenarios as people prepare for going into education and work and what may happen, to the degree possible, once the person is comfortable with their supervisor. And of course that happens different timing for different people and depending on what type of work they're in, but there could be an open door also when the time is right to have some conversation with their supervisor about that if they feel like there is a threat there. But I think case managers keeping this open, trusting dialogue is probably one of the key things.
Great, thank you for sharing, Courtney. Andrea, I know there was a question about adult sex crime victims, and I know you mentioned you have a new pilot program with TASA. Is there anything else that you can share with us about that, or how we're addressing adult sex crime victims?
Yeah, so one, we have the the Sexual Assault Survivor Task Force at the governor's office, which is focused specifically on survivors of sexual assault. Two, we have a relationship with TASA, where we are looking into piloting adult care coordination within targeted domestic violence shelters and rape crisis centers. And I know that BCFS is, it's a global nonprofit based out of San Antonio, recently received a federal grant to do just that. So they will be rolling that out in Bexar County, as well as some of their other counties that are nearby. So it's happening, and I know that the Survivor Leadership Council has already consulted on that, which is fantastic. Their help is so needed.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. I think we've answered most of our questions. We do have a follow-up question from Vicki. I'm not sure which organization she's with, but she talked about developing protocols for newer organizations. I don't know if any of our panels want to jump in with ways to get involved. I know we have newsletters and things. If anyone wants to reach out to us, we're happy to put you on our newsletters. I think the most important thing is just this relationship building like we're doing right now. But if any of our panelists have any sort of thoughts on that question, feel free to jump in.
Vicki, if you want to contact us, I think I can help you with that. We have some templates for protocols. It's just my name, andrea.sparks@gov.texas.gov.
Great, thanks, Andrea, for addressing that. So I don't think there's too many other questions in the chat. I don't know, Emily, do you want to wrap it up, or do we want to keep going?
Yeah, I think that'd be great. I know we all probably have other obligations, but I hope you join me in thanking our tremendous panel for their discussion today. I think it was really phenomenal. So thank you all for their speakers. I think it was really, really great today. Just to remind you guys to find us on social media, the Coordinating Council. We are here on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. As well, I popped this up a couple times, but for more information or to get on our email address, please email us at humantrafficking@oag.texas.gov. And then just a reminder that this is our second to last webinar. So we have one more next Tuesday at 12 p.m. same time. Please send us an email to make sure that you are registered, but we hope to see you next week. Thank you so much. Have a great day.